Pamela Hogan, welcome to Beyond Borders, August 2015.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
It's fantastic you're here again. You were here last year,
A couple years ago.
a couple of years ago, and this year you're here to do what? Can you share with us?
I'm here in connection with the Women in Conflict theme this year, because several years ago, with two colleagues, I co-created a five-part series on television for public television in America, but it's been used all over the world, on women, war, and peace. And we were really focused on the fact that generally the mainstream media, when they cover conflict, looks at sort of the men and the guns. But today's wars, it's actually considered to be more dangerous to be a woman than to be a soldier. And so we were looking at what that means, but also at women's roles at advocating for peace and for reconciliation and involvement in tribunals, which are establishing new laws about, for example, sexual slavery in wars.
And who have you brought this year? Which sort of countries are represented?
We filmed in Bosnia with a group of women who were the first women in history to witness at an international tribunal to the sexual violence that they'd experienced, and they changed international law. We filmed in Afghanistan with women who were trying to become part of the peace process. Filmed in Liberia with the Women's Nonviolent Coalition, who actually helped bring about an end to the war there. We filmed in Colombia with women who were trying to save their communities from being forced out by armed groups. And then we did a sort of a think piece at the end about how war has changed and how war is targeting women in new ways, but women are also playing new roles in conflict resolution.
So we've seen, I think, over the last year some unique and sort of terrifying dimensions to post-conflict states and attacks on civil populations, particularly women and girls. I'm thinking of ISIS in Syria, northern Iraq, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. What's the thinking about how we can possibly address these issues and further protect women and girls over these sort of new forms of extremism that we haven't seen before and haven't really prepared for?
That's a very, very good question, and I don't think there's any simple answer. The first thing is to recognize that these these wars are playing out on women's bodies in those regions right now, and that they're being targeted in just radical ways that are beyond horrific. One thing that is happening is that women from war zones like Liberia, where they've been able to sort of group together and come up with solutions and strategic ways of advocating for change, are reaching out to women in these other war zones. Women are talking to women. And that's becoming very helpful. We recently heard, for example, that the film we made in Bosnia was just used a few months ago among refugee Syrian women on the border of Turkey, who watched it and were inspired or amazed that they were hearing stories from women in Bosnia in the 1990s that sounded to them so similar to what was going on in Syria. And they started sort of grouping together to talk about ways to record testimony, prepare themselves for future, litigation, and that they were inspired by those stories.
So, I think one of the challenges we face is accountability. There seems to me to be an accountability gap that is profound and deep in terms of criminal accountability. So we have cross-fertilization of ideas, sharing of lessons and best practices, but ultimately it seems no one's ever held accountable. Do you agree? And in the event, how do we address that accountability gap that seems to me to be vast and deepening?
I can only speak as a filmmaker, which is to say that the first thing is to get the stories, capture the stories, because once you've captured them, you cannot say that did not happen. And with today's, readily accessible media, where films are being made on smartphones now, all over the world, we are able to capture those stories, and people in the conflict zones can capture those stories. That's absolutely paramount for any kind of accountability. And if the accountability isn't happening in sort of the international tribunals,
Right.
It can happen in local ways, and every post-conflict zone can figure out their own solutions. But first, you need the stories.
I agree with you. I think although I'm depressed by what I call this vacuum in accountability, I think we have to recognize it's a long game. And that accountability may not come in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in Yemen or in Syria or in Iraq. But what's central is gathering that information, that story, and securing that, because in due course it may well be relevant and admissible in a tribunal, whether it's a local tribunal or a hybrid or an international tribunal. So that's for me an important part of our role at the UN is in terms of our messaging, is to recognize that we're all in this for the long term, that we're not going away. But for now, the centrality is around the stories and telling the stories.
And, part of accountability is what is the narrative in that country after the war is over? And there's countervailing narratives, and who owns the narrative?
Right.
And so that's why, the narrative is important, memorialization is important, so that kids, the next generation coming up, knows what happened. We see that in Germany, it's taken generations, but the story is known and the story is accepted. And that's not the case in other post-war zones, but that's the goal, and clearly filmmaking can be an important part of that.
Pamela Hogan, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure.